Hello everybody! Now today I'm going to be talking about the books I've been reading. Well, on the prompt about a biography should be written by an enemy. I believe that was one of the prompts. I probably haven't got the exact terminology right, but I'm still kind of new to a lot of these things, and as you guys know, I'm dyslexic, so reading isn't my strong point. Which is probably why I'm bringing in a picture book. Because while it's slightly inspired by this, I thought I'd read, well, this. The Story of Captain Cook, a Ladybird book, An Adventure in History. Written by Garde Peach. First published in 1958. But I also wanted to compare it to something more modern. So I have Captain James Cook, the Pacific Explorer. Both of these are aimed at roughly the same aim group. Basically, these are children's history books. And funnily enough, this one happens to also be to have been published in Australia. So, yes. Written by R.T. Watts, first published in 2020, and this edition I've got was from its 2024 reprint, so hopefully this is perhaps quite, as it were, up to date, one might say. You know, updating from this, because yes, there are some details, so this book does describe Canada and Australia as self-governing dominions, which in 1958 was still accurate, but obviously now, you know, the Canada Act in 1982 made Canada a fully independent country, so yeah, that detail has been updated. So obviously this book can't have written that far ahead. But there are other ways we are going to explore. Yes, we will also be touching on issues of race in this video. Both do have differing depictions when it comes to Indigenous Pacific peoples, so it's part of the books, and it's something to talk about. Now, there are degrees of similarity. Both these books are biographies, and both would fall into the category of great person history. So you see, for those who don't know, great person history refers to the idea that history is driven by the actions and decisions of key individuals in certain positions. Now, Watts' book perhaps does this less than the Ladybird book, as we will explore. But I thought I'd better let you know, for anyone who doesn't know, what great person history is. Now, there is something called great man history, which is different to great person history. Because you see, it's not just a gender-neutral name, but great person history also comes from a more academic discipline aspect, whereby we look to see and understand, you know, where these people came from, what drove them to make their decisions, so on and so forth. However, the great man history tends to be a lot more simplistic, is probably the way to put it here. It tends to focus on heroes and villains, and well, especially older biographies can often present their subject as a great hero or a dastardly villain, which is more akin to storybook writing than it is to actual history. Whereas great person history seeks to understand these key individuals, even if it shares that similar premise, that history is driven by their decisions rather than, say, wider forces of history. Thank you very much, my ducking historian. But anyway, so as I say, both books explore the life of Captain Cook. And both books do portray Cook in a more positive light. This one especially. Both of them present him as a self-made man from small-town Yorkshire who grew up, found his way to sea, and was better at his job than a lot of the other officers because he knew he had to be, because he wasn't wealthy or well-connected, you know. And so present him as overcoming the challenges of not being wealthy or well-connected by merit. But there are some interesting differences as well. First off, the Ladybird book goes into a lot more detail about the war with France. That is known as either the 7 Years' War or the French-Indian War, depending on which history you're reading. And while Watt's book does touch on this, it tends to be less detail. There's a lot less detail. It doesn't, for a start, Watt doesn't really go into multi-page detail on Captain Cook's part in Wolfe's attack on Quebec. It tends to but you know, that's almost expected given the title is about him being a Pacific explorer, so that's more like the background. In fact, this is an important point because one impression Ed got from the Ladybird book was that it was a lot more nation-oriented in certain ways about, you know, portraying Cook as a great man in all these kind of ways, a skilled navigator, a kind man who was always good to the indigenous peoples, who are referred to as natives. The Ladybird book does use terms like civilized, which are not really a good thing in that sense, and I'm not talking about quoting sources from the time, but in the main text. This kind of focus on the sort of great national hero and being a big part of the reason why Australia, New Zealand and Canada are part of the British Commonwealth is rather absent, is not really gone into in Watt's book, in the Explore book by Watts. You know, Watts tends to go into a lot more detail about the voyages. And yes, I do quite like the way he goes into the maps. You know, R.T. Watts seems to focus on the exploring aspect, and have got to discuss race. For both books take a very different attitude when discussing the indigenous Pacific peoples. And, you know, it's not the only example. So, for example, I mean, when the Ladybird book describes the final voyage where Cook is trying to find the Northwest Passage, he's sailed up to Siberia and is like planning to go over to the Atlantic side to see if there's a navigable route atop Canada, and he arrives in Siberia and needs to map the area. And it says, and I quote, these Russian fishermen had never heard of England or even Europe, and of course only spoke their own language. But they could draw, and they and Cook sat at a table drawing charts. the Explore book has no mention of whether the Russian fishermen knew about Europe. Also, Cook's a lot more part of a team in this. So, when it comes to solving scurvy through sauerkraut, well, firstly, Explore goes into a lot more detail about what scurvy is. But, whereas in the Ladybird book, Cook figures out, it's Cook who comes up with the idea of using sauerkraut, the Explore book says how he was told of this idea. But as you say, there's a very big difference between he figured it out for himself and he was told of this method. But, so as we see, we have a whole, as it were, chapter on scurvy. Yes. As it says, Cook was told about a new way to stop scurvy, whereas the Ladybird book says Captain Cook was the first man to think of a way to prevent this, scurvy, from happening. Very different. Also, the Ladybird book, then, when we come to Indigenous people, we need to talk about how the Ladybird book has a very different way of talking about Indigenous peoples. As it says on page 32, when it talks about a time that Cook was attacked by the Maoris, Cook always treated natives well, and it was unfortunate that he was, on this occasion, forced to take such action as to fire on them in self-defence. What Explore doesn't have that story, and it also doesn't mention anything about the Hawaiians thinking about the Maui. Sorry, and I'll be specific here. Yes. The Maui. Specifically. The Ladybird book describes, as it says, quote, "Nor had the natives ever seen a white man, and they believed him," Captain Cook, "to be the god of their tribe by the name Orono." I apologise if I've mispronounced that. "Nothing Cook could do or say could make them understand that he was only a man like themselves. All the time he was there, he was treated like a god with ceremonies and offerings." The idea that the Maui treated Captain Cook as a god is not mentioned in the Explore book. Now, yes, also it should be noted the way that, according to the Ladybird book, despite the Maui treating Captain Cook as a deity in their version, saying, "But this did not prevent the natives, who were great thieves, from trying to steal anything they could from the ship." Yes. That's a pretty, how do they say it on the internet these days? Yikesy kind of idea? Yeah. Or at least, it probably is a very of its time style of talking about Indigenous people. There is something in the Explore book that the Ladybird book doesn't mention. Simply that Captain Cook... Yes. So here's how it talks about Captain Cook and Hawaii. Towards the end, Cook sailed south again to Hawaii, mapped the islands, He was getting on well with the Hawaiian people when disputes started over a stolen boat that Cook wanted back. He decided to take the chief as a hostage, but this was a bad move. The local people panicked and started attacking him. The Ladybird book does not mention an attempt to take the chief hostage to resolve the dispute over the boat. Yes. It does say, now apparently when he talks about Cook returning, it says that he found the natives had changed in their manners towards him and his crew. Perhaps they thought one whose ship could be damaged by a storm could not be their god, Orono. Not only were they less friendly, but they were more than ever inclined to steal from the white men. Yes. Interesting choice of phrase, one might say, and well, this book is perhaps useful for studying the history as it was written, at least written back in the 1950s. Anyway. So it says that Cook landed to demand the boat's return. Because of the unfriendly attitude of the natives, he took with him a boatload of sailors armed with muskets. Yes, it does seem to put the indigenous Hawaiians in the most negative light. It was then that the tragedy occurred. The natives attacked Cook, and for some reason the men in his boat did not come to help him. Before he could get back to them, he was killed. See, back in the 1950s, it should be noticed that often indigenous and non-white stories weren't as well versed in academia. These stories weren't often told. What we call subaltern perspectives. This also applies to women and working class people. But point is, one of the things that subaltern history tries to do is find out what was going on in the past from a wider societal perspective, including those who are not part of the dominant groups. And so we see from the Ladybird book an example of a very lopsided in favour of Cook and less sympathetic to the indigenous Hawaiians. But yes, well, these were certainly interesting reads, especially to see how the history has evolved. And yes, I know I'm slightly biased coming from colonised background, being part Irish. But, you know, I'm also part British, English and Scottish, part Dutch, part Belgian, part Portuguese as well, so, you know, so a lot of so yeah, there was that sort of background culture of popular history of sort of the age of explorers in a kind of heroic sort of way that... So you could see traces of... So I could see that while, you know, some of the attitudes in this book might be not good. Not as good. In fact, I'm not saying this is a bad book necessarily, but perhaps one that should be read in an understanding of its historical period. Perhaps as a study of how we, where we have come from, to try and understand the history of how people thought about indigenous peoples, which can inform some of the attitudes of our culture today. Because some of these ideas do linger on. You know, we're starting to have these sort of questioned, challenged. More details are brought in, a much more nuanced understanding of issues comes about. So anyway, that's the sort of reading thing I've done, and, well, I hope you found this little dive into history interesting. I did a video a few years back about different forms of history which might be of interest to you. I'll leave a link to it in the description, but either way, it was lovely having you here.